not have agreed to come if I knew that Mr. Madison and I were to share the stage. He betrayed me rather dramatically. You were a wise man not to tell me until now. But I bid you this windy evening good day, Americans. That is the highest compliment that I may pay. American, not Colorado, Virginian, or Dakota, but American. Alone among the founding fathers, I was not burdened with the problem of having a home state. Mr. Jefferson, a man most unwise in almost every aspect, once wrote, "What a difficult thing it is to be 300 miles from one's own country." He was in Philadelphia, speaking of Virginia. In the magnificent library at Monticello, the law books of the other states were listed under the heading Foreign Lands. And as President of the United States, he referred to the government in Washington City as the Foreign Department. Mr. Jefferson would always say the United States are. I would always say the United States is. And so I'm pleased to be with you this day, because I will confess at the end of my life, I did not know the future. My life was in shadow, both publicly and privately. My private life was in shambles. My economics were challenging, though not nearly as much as Mr. Jefferson. I had purchased 30 acres of prime farmland in Harlem, and in 3 years had succeeded in raising $18 worth of asparagus and strawberries. And I remarked to a friend, "I'm as ill-suited to be a farmer as Mr. Jefferson is to be at the helm of the nation." Privately, my wife, Elizabeth, and I had suffered a catastrophic loss. My firstborn son, Philip, had been killed in a duel, defending my honor. My oldest daughter, his sister Angelica, went mad with grief. And for the remainder of her sad life, she would sit at the pianoforte in the clothing of 1802 and play the songs of that year again and again. Publicly, my vision of America, the Federalist notion, had been trounced. Mr. Jefferson was President of the United States, and worse than that, with my aid, which I can discuss if you wish in a moment. But I could not know at that time if the shadow over my life was a long winter's night or a brief eclipse. And it is a pleasure to be with you now to realize it was the briefest eclipse. You are in every way a thoroughly Hamiltonian nation. You have retained the Jeffersonian veneer to make you feel good about yourselves. But you are fundamentally Hamiltonian. I am certainly pleased to be in the West, a land I did not visit in life, but I knew we were destined to occupy. I said the salvation of this nation depends upon men who are continental in their... I believed that we would occupy from ocean to ocean. And in this way, Mr. Jefferson and I agreed. He believed it would take... Now, in my day, we wore wigs, and we did not wear them on windy days. You are perhaps understanding why. Mr. Jefferson was quite sure that the American spirit was such that we would put our first villages into York, California within 900 years. I believe that he was far too pessimistic. I believe within 300 years we would reach the Pacific. What a remarkable achievement you have made. I will also point out, in the shadows of the Rocky Mountains, I see Captain Pike's Peak beyond. Mr. Jefferson, in instructing Lewis and Clark on the scientific measures, he believed that symmetry must exist. Therefore, the Rocky Mountains would be equal to the Alleghanies. Thereby, Meriwether Lewis calculated a 6-hour transit of the Rocky Mountains. And he also instructed him that since nothing ever goes away, to be on the lookout for the woolly mammoth. But you are a Hamiltonian nation. You have swept away the nonsense that you might call the Jefferson music. Mr. Jefferson would wax poetic about the nobility of the human spirit, about if government would simply be out of the way, we could live in Mr. Jefferson's agrarian paradise. And this gets to the fundamental difference between myself and him in the founding of this nation. Mr. Jefferson believed that man was basically good. I believe that man is basically, well, as I wrote in Federalist 6, ambitious, vindictive, and rapacious. I offer as evidence that I am correct the totality of human history. And I would ask those of you who are clinging to your Jeffersonian ideals if you lock the door of your home before coming here tonight. Because if you are a Jeffersonian, you need no locks. Mr. Jefferson believed that a nation like ours at the time of the founding, 97% of Americans were farmers. And you would farm during the day, and at night you would play your violin, or you would read your living in the original, and you would endure this wonderful utopia. And I am sometimes asked, why did I push for a mechanical age, for an industrial society? And I say, what are you willing to give up to live in Mr. Jefferson's utopia? Because there are things that are the product of an industrial society. And I say, will you give your entertainment machines? And the parents in the audience always nod and say, yes, indeed. And then they say they only watch something they call PBS. I don't know what that means. And then I say, will you give up the refrigeration of your food? And they pause. And I say, will you give up your children's antibiotics? These are the products of an industrial civilization. Mr. Jefferson had 6 children. 4 died before the age of 5 of illnesses cured by a single visit in your day to a physician. It does not sound utopian to me. And so I'm pleased to be here to see the vindication. I'm pleased to be here as a martial man, as a military man, because I know your city has embraced an important military tradition, and I think that's honorable, with your tribute to the Medal of Honor. As you evaluate, I understand I'm here in an election year when you have 2 enlightened and compassionate men seeking in a reasoned discourse to obtain your support for office. I would claim that this is a dissent, but I will actually tell you that in the election of 1800, the single dirtiest election in American history, in which I aided Mr. Jefferson to the White House, there was a broadside, what you would call a political poster, which read, if the atheist Jefferson is elected, every Bible in America will be seized and burned, every virgin deflowered, and the streets will run red with the blood of murdered patriots. That is a negative ad. You are pretenders in your day. Mr. Jefferson was president because he quite simply wanted to be. You know, in my day, the notion was that you would pretend to have no interest in office and it would be thrust upon you against your will. But I once wrote, Mr. Jefferson quests most ardently for the presidential chair. And he would send his friends, some old, long-time friends, some new, formerly friends of others. And they would campaign on his behalf. And he would reluctantly accept office. He said, when a man quests for office, a certain rottenness of the soul by necessity must creep in. He quested for office. And Mr. Adams, who was there are children present, I must be careful what I say. Mr. Adams was president after General Washington. Now I must explain that General Washington was quite simply the greatest American that has lived. I know that in your day you revere your Mr. Lincoln, your Mr. Roosevelts. But quite simply, without George Washington, there is no America. One of the great challenges in your day is that you have been poorly taught your entire life. You have been taught a notion of the American founding that is idyllic and matches the white marble statues you have chosen to immortalize the Founding Fathers with. The simple fact is that we were men with passions we agreed on very little. I would think it's safe to say that Mr. Jefferson and I agreed on only 2 things: our respect for General Washington and our loathing for Aaron Burr. Beyond that, we had no idea at all. And so it was that General Washington, when he became president, now I'd been his closest aide in the war. Aaron Burr had actually been hired to be an aide-de-camp. He had lasted 10 days before he was sacked for opening the general's private mail and reading it. But General Washington became a father to me. My own father had left when I was but a lad of perhaps 10 on a business trip of 3 months that extended to 38 years, and I would never see him again. My mother died shortly after that, and I was essentially orphaned. And George Washington became an important father figure to me in many, many ways. He then called upon me to be his closest aide in creating the new government. This was most irritating to what I called the Virginia junta. The Virginians who felt that Virginians should always be in charge of everything. But without exception, General Washington took my advice on the bank, on assumption of debts, on all of the major issues. He took my advice. And the Virginians were perplexed. But after 2 terms, well, I must say, there's a third area that Mr. Jefferson and I agreed. The general wished to only serve 1 term as president. And we prevailed upon him. We said the country is simply not yet ready. And he was agreed to have a 2nd term. And he said, I only have regretted 1 moment of the 2nd term, and that is each and every goddamned moment therein. Again, this is where your white statues do not capture what the Founding Fathers were. General Washington, the closest thing to a father I had, I loved him dearly, and I wrote of him, he is the most horrid swearer and blasphemer, a man capable of purple and volcanic rages. There is a word that never appears in a single thing General Washington ever wrote. That word is Jesus. In your day, you have this idyllic notion and are simply wrong. So General Washington's 2nd term ended. Mr. Adams, as the vice president, assumed it would be his due to ascend to the presidency for as long as he wished. When he first became vice president, the first 3 weeks of the United States Senate's time, with him presiding in the chair, were discussing what title he should be known by. There were a number of ideas. His Most Royal Highness the Vice President, His Excellency, I mean, it went on. It was 3 weeks, Mr. Adams. He called me a number of things. He did not like me at all. He called me that little man. I was taller than him. He called me the most indefatigable intriguer in the United States and possibly in the world. He said of me that there are not enough horrors in Christendom to draw out my superabundance of secretions. And most famously, he called me the bastard brat of a Scotch peasant. I simply called him your rotundity. But Mr. Adams was a failed Federalist, and as his term began to wane, I did not wish him to have a 2nd term. I was the leader of the Federalist Party, and always he had retained General Washington's cabinet, which had complete loyalty to me and not to Mr. Adams, which I understand was irritating to him. During the quasi-war with the French in 1794, General Washington had agreed to be in charge of the army on the proviso that he would only take the field if the French invaded, and he would get to pick his own deputy. He picked me. Mr. Adams was forced to make me Major General Commander of all U.S. forces. So he was irritated. He was more irritated by something I did in the election. I wrote a pamphlet which contained 3 parts. The first part explained why Mr. Adams was a failure. The second part explained my reasoning and logic, and the third part said, nonetheless, I do not wish to deny him a single Federalist vote in the Electoral College. The first section was 54 pages, the second section 4 pages, and the third section 4 paragraphs, and Mr. Adams was distressed. Mr. Jefferson, at this point, leapt to his political ambitions. He wanted to be President of the United States. And so in the first blatantly political act in our history, he picked a vice presidential running mate based on geography. If you remember the obscenity of the 3/5 clause, the southern states had a number of electoral votes, but they didn't have quite enough. And so Mr. Jefferson turned to a New Yorker to be his running mate as vice president. The only problem was this gentleman was a member of our party. But upon being offered the vice presidential nomination, Aaron Burr switched parties and became Mr. Jefferson's running mate. The election was very interesting because one error we had made at the Constitutional Convention, later corrected by the 12th Amendment, we provided in the original Constitution that the person who got the most electoral votes would be president, and the person who got the second most would be vice president. Our theory was then we allowed the two greatest men working together. And this worked in the first and second election with General Washington, but in the third election, when Mr. Adams was elected, Mr. Jefferson became his vice president, and Mr. Adams, in an act I would call noble, went to Mr. Jefferson and said, "Sir, we have both been elected, shall we rule together?" And Mr. Jefferson said, "No, thank you," and proceeded to use public money to fund a private press to attack myself and Mr. Adams. So it was quite clear in the election of 1800 that things would be different, but the 12th Amendment had not yet been passed, and so when the votes were counted, Mr. Jefferson and Colonel Burr were tied in the Electoral College at 73 electoral votes each. Now everyone in the country knew that Mr. Jefferson was to be president and Colonel Burr to be vice president, everyone except Colonel Burr, who understood that if he could get a single delegate to change votes, instead of being the worthless position of vice president, he would be president. So for 35 ballots in the House of Representatives, no one was victorious. And finally, I could stand it no longer. I took quill in hand, and I wrote to William Bayard, the delegate from Connecticut. And I said of Mr. Jefferson, "It is true that his politics are tinctured with fanaticism, that he is too earnest in his democracy, that he is not mindful of his means of success, nor scrupulous of his means of truth, and that he is a contemptible hypocrite. But by every virtuous and prudent calculation, Mr. Jefferson is to be preferred over Burr. He is by far not so dangerous a man, and he has pretensions to character." On the 36th ballot, Mr. Bayard withheld his vote. Mr. Jefferson was elected president, and not surprisingly did not give his vice president, Aaron Burr, many duties. Mr. Burr was irritated with me. He would later run for governor of New York in 1802. I would again intervene. He would be defeated. He would become more irritated until finally he was very irritated. And I want to point something out. When we dueled, Mr. Burr was the vice president of the United States. Now, what would happen in your day if a vice president gunned a man down? And so, perhaps you have a bit of the flavor of the time. It was a time of passion. For the first time in American history, a people said, "We are the equal of the king." For the first time in human history, a people fought a war to be liberated. Not to replace one despot with another, but to have common rule, where the people choose their leaders. And so, we began our government. The Constitution was controversial. I would later say of it as a frail and worthless fabric that I've done more to prop up than any other. I felt it was far too weak. Mr. Jefferson felt it was far too strong. But I knew that it was important that it be ratified because the Articles of Confederation had failed and our nation was on a precipice. And so I called upon my friend, James Madison, and my friend, Mr. Jay, and we crafted what in your day you call the Federalist Papers. These appeared 2 a week in newspapers arguing that the very things that people feared in the Constitution were in fact the greatest strengths it had. As I wrote in Federalist 84, the Constitution is, for every rational sense and for every useful purpose, a Bill of Rights. I will admit that a Bill of Rights was later added. That was foolish. A Bill of Rights is a dangerous thing. But ultimately, with the Federalist Papers, with a lot of hard work, it was some political maneuvering, the Constitution was ratified. In your day, you know it worked, but in our day, it was not clear. It passed in Virginia by 3 votes. And so, I guess what I wish to get across to you this night is that the founding of this country was a chancy thing. The people who founded this nation were men primarily, and a handful of women, and Abigail Adams being among them, who were remarkable people, but human, with frailties. Some of us had marital issues. Some of us had corruption issues. We were regular people in an extraordinary time. And I could wax on for some time. I would begin by repeating my 5-hour address, but I believe you wish Mr. Madison to join. And so if this is what you wish, madam, I will have Mr. Madison and I will retreat. And then when we are ready, we will again speak. Thank you for your time.